Wyoming Territory, 1878. The night wind howled across the open range like a wounded animal, slashing through the weathered boards of the Lucky Strike saloon. Luke O'Malley nursed his whiskey by the dying fire, watching shadows dance across rough-hewn walls. At 25, he'd already seen enough frontier violence to last several lifetimes. The flickering lamplight caught the hard planes of his face, handsome in a rugged way, with clear blue eyes that rarely softened and a strong jaw sporting 3 days of light stubble. His broad shoulders carried invisible weights. "Last call, O'Malley," Hank the barkeep announced, wiping down the scarred bar counter. "Storm's rolling in something fierce." Luke nodded, draining his glass. The whiskey burned going down, but it never quite managed to scorch away the memories. 5 years since he'd buried his parents after the raid, 5 years of drifting from ranch to ranch, never staying, never connecting. Attachments were dangerous in Wyoming Territory. A man survived by relying on himself alone. "Might be smart to stay the night," Hank suggested, eyeing the rattling windows. "Got a room upstairs." "My cabin's not far," Luke replied, reaching for his hat. "Been through worse than a spring storm." His small homestead lay 3 miles outside of Laramie, close enough to civilization when necessary, far enough to keep the world at arm's length. Just the way he preferred it, Luke had built it himself, had slowly accumulated a respectable herd of cattle, all without depending on anyone. The moment you leaned on others was the moment you set yourself up for disappointment. Or worse, he stepped out onto the covered porch, watching fat raindrops slam against the mud street. Lightning flashed across the sky, momentarily illuminating the town of Laramie in stark white light. Most sensible folks were tucked away in their homes, waiting out nature's fury. The clock in the church tower struck midnight just as Luke spotted something unusual through the curtain of rain, a slender figure moving through the downpour toward the saloon. No horse, no escort. Just a lone person fighting against the wind and rain. A woman, Luke frowned. Decent women didn't wander Laramie's streets at midnight, certainly not alone during a storm. He considered simply mounting his horse and heading home, leaving whatever trouble this was to someone else's concern. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way she struggled against the gale, determination in every step. Or maybe it was the simple fact that there wasn't another soul around to offer assistance. The woman climbed the steps to the saloon porch, seemingly unaware of his presence in the shadows. When she stepped into the pool of light from the saloon window, Luke's breath caught. She was young, no more than 21 or 22, with delicate features framed by drenched honey-blonde hair that escaped from beneath her sodden bonnet. Despite her bedraggled state, there was unmistakable beauty there. Her traveling dress, once fine, was now plastered to her slender frame, and she shivered violently. As she reached for the saloon door, Luke cleared his throat. "Ma'am, the place is closing up." She startled, whirling to face him, pressing one gloved hand to her chest. "Oh, I didn't see you there." Her voice carried the refined tones of the East, confirming what her attire suggested. She wasn't from Laramie. "Saloon's no place for a lady," Luke said flatly, "especially at this hour." "I'm looking for accommodations," she replied, lifting her chin with pride despite her trembling. "I was told this establishment might have rooms available." Luke's eyes dropped to her mudded boots caked with Wyoming soil. The stains reached halfway up her calves, speaking of a long, difficult journey on foot. "Where's your horse?" he asked. Something flickered in her eyes, fear perhaps, or caution. "I don't have one." "No one travels these parts without a horse." "I did." Her tone brooked no further questions on the matter. Luke frowned. "How'd you get here then?" "I walked from the stagecoach stop at Miller's Crossing." "That's 15 miles out." "I'm aware of the distance, sir." 15 miles on foot in this weather. Luke studied her more carefully. Behind the proud demeanor, exhaustion shadowed her eyes. And something else, wariness like a hunted animal. "Hank," Luke called over his shoulder, "lady here needs a room." The barkeeper appeared in the doorway. "Sorry, miss, got no rooms for single ladies." "This ain't that kind of establishment." Luke watched her shoulders slump slightly before she squared them again. "I see. Could you recommend somewhere else?" "Widow Jenkins sometimes takes in boarders," Hank offered. "But she's clear on the other side of town, not a place you want to walk to alone at this hour." Lightning flashed again, followed by a thunderclap that rattled the porch boards. The woman flinched, clutching her small travel bag tighter. Luke sighed, already regretting the words forming in his mouth. "I've got a place, small cabin outside town. You can have the bed tonight, I'll take the floor." Her eyes widened with alarm. "I couldn't possibly." It's that or the street, Luke said bluntly, and nobody survives a night like this without shelter in Wyoming. She hesitated, clearly weighing the danger of accompanying a stranger against the certainty of exposure to the elements. I don't even know your name, she said finally, Luke O'Malley. Penelope Sinclair. She offered her hand formally, as though they were meeting at a social gathering rather than on a saloon porch during a midnight storm. Luke looked at her outstretched hand for a moment before taking it briefly. Can you ride, Miss Sinclair? My horse is around back. I can manage, she replied with the first hint of a smile he'd seen, though it's been some time. Luke nodded toward the linta behind the saloon. Wait here, I'll fetch Thunder. Minutes later, he led his chestnut gelding around front. The horse's ears flicked nervously at the thunder, but he remained steady, a quality Luke valued above all others. He mounted first, then reached down to help Penelope. She hesitated only briefly before grasping his forearm. Luke pulled her up behind him, feeling her slight weight settle against the saddle. Hold on, he instructed, and after a moment's hesitation he felt her arms encircle his waist. It had been years since Luke had been this close to a woman, years since he'd allowed anyone to touch him with such casual intimacy. Thunder picked his way carefully through the muddy streets, his powerful muscles working beneath them. Luke kept the pace deliberate, mindful of the treacherous footing and his unexpected passenger. The town fell away behind them as they followed the road that wound through scattered pines toward his property. What brings you to Laramie? Luke asked over his shoulder, more to break the uncomfortable silence than from genuine curiosity. There was a pause before she answered, a fresh start. Luke recognized the evasion but didn't press. Everyone in the West had something they were running from, himself included. The past was best left buried. Alone, he couldn't help asking. Yes, just one word, but it carried weight. They rode the rest of the way in silence, the only sounds the steady drumming of rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. Penelope's grip tightened with each lightning flash, but she made no complaint about the weather or the journey. When the cabin came into view, Luke felt an unexpected twinge of self-consciousness. It was a simple structure, one room with a small linta stable attached. He'd built it for function, not comfort, with his own hands over the course of a brutal winter. It's not much, he said as he dismounted, helping her down from the saddle. It's shelter, she replied, looking at the cabin with what seemed like genuine appreciation. That's all that matters tonight. Luke led Thunder to the lean-to, quickly unsaddling him and making sure he had feed. By the time he'd tended to the horse, Penelope was shivering violently on the cabin's small porch. He unlocked the door and ushered her inside, quickly lighting the oil lamp on the table. The cabin's interior was Spartan but neat, a bed against one wall, a wood stove opposite, a table with 2 chairs, and a trunk containing his few possessions. A rifle hung above the door. Let me get a fire going, Luke said, moving to the wood stove. He worked in silence, arranging kindling and logs, striking a match. Soon, the first tentative flames began to lick at the dry wood. When he turned around, Penelope stood exactly where he'd left her, dripping on the plank floor, her face pale with cold. You need dry clothes, he stated flatly. She looked down at her sodden dress, then back up at him with uncertainty. I'm afraid my bag got rather wet as well. Luke moved to his trunk, rummaging until he found a clean flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that had grown too small for him. These will have to do, they'll be large, but they're dry. He handed them to her, then pointed to a screen in the corner. You can change there, I'll fix something warm to drink. While she changed, Luke heated water for coffee, trying not to think about the young woman behind the screen. It had been 3 years since he'd had a woman in his cabin, not since Mary Cook, the blacksmith's daughter, had made it clear she was interested in more than friendship. Luke had ended that quickly. Attachments were dangerous. People left or died or betrayed you, better to keep to himself. Thank you for the clothes, Penelope said, emerging from behind the screen. Luke turned and something unfamiliar twisted in his chest. His flannel shirt hung nearly to her knees, the sleeves rolled up multiple times to free her hands. She'd belted the trousers with what appeared to be a length of ribbon from her dress. Her honey-blonde hair, freed from its pins, fell in damp waves past her shoulders. Without the formal dress, she looked younger, more vulnerable, but also somehow more real. She draped her wet garments over the screen, along with a pair of mudded boots that told a story of desperate travel. Coffee, he offered, gesturing toward the pot. Please, she settled into one of the chairs, tucking her bare feet beneath her. Luke poured 2 cups, setting one before her. He remained standing, leaning against the wall, watching as she wrapped her slender fingers around the mug, seeking its warmth. Those boots have seen a lot of miles today, he observed. Penelope glanced toward the screen where her footwear dripped onto the floor. They're the only pair I own. I didn't anticipate needing to walk so far. What happened to your transportation? Luke pressed gently. She took a sip of coffee before answering. The stagecoach was supposed to go all the way to Laramie, but there was trouble with a wheel at Miller's Crossing. The driver said they'd continue in the morning after repairs. She hesitated. I couldn't wait. Luke frowned. So you decided to walk 15 miles alone with night coming on and a storm brewing. That's not just unwise, Miss Sinclair. Out here, that's practically suicidal. I had my reasons, she replied, her voice hardening slightly. And I made it, didn't I? Barely, and only because I happened to be at the saloon at midnight. Her green eyes flashed. I would have found a solution, I always do. Something in her tone, fierce determination beneath refined manners, gave Luke pause. This was not some helpless eastern flower who'd wandered into the wilderness unprepared. There was steel underneath those delicate features. You're running from something, he stated. It wasn't a question. Penelope's fingers tightened around her mug. Aren't we all, Mr. O'Malley? Their eyes met across the small table, an understanding passing between them. They recognized in each other the watchfulness that came from carrying invisible wounds. Get some sleep, Luke said finally, breaking the connection. You take the bed, I'll make a pallet here by the fire. I can't take your bed. You can and you will, he interrupted. I've slept on worse than my own floor. Penelope looked like she wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was evident in every line of her body. Thank you, she said simply. Luke gathered a blanket and pillow from the trunk, arranging them near the stove. We'll figure out your situation in the morning. My situation? Where you're going, what you need, he shrugged. Laramie's not big, but there are decent folks who might help. I don't need charity, she said, a flash of pride coloring her tone. Good, Luke replied, because I don't offer it, but everyone needs something when they first arrive. Work maybe, or directions. Penelope nodded slowly. I'll be on my way tomorrow. I won't impose further on your kindness. Luke didn't correct her assumption that he was being kind. He wasn't even sure what had prompted him to offer shelter to a stranger. Self-preservation had been his guiding principle for years. Keep your head down, tend your own business, depend on no one. And yet here he was, sharing his private space with a woman he knew nothing about. The storm should pass by morning, he said, more to himself than to her. Penelope moved to the bed, perching on its edge. Do you have family in Laramie, Mr. O'Malley? No, the single word carried enough finality to discourage further questions. She seemed to understand, nodding slightly. Well, I'm grateful for your assistance tonight. Not everyone would help a stranger. Luke extinguished the lamp, leaving only the orange glow from the wood stove to illuminate the cabin. Get some rest, Miss Sinclair. He settled onto his makeshift bed, listening as she slipped beneath the blankets. The storm continued to rage outside, rain lashing against the windows, but inside an unexpected peace had settled over the cabin. Within minutes he heard Penelope's breathing deepen and even out as exhaustion claimed her. Luke lay awake much longer, staring at the ceiling beams, wondering what chain of events had led a well-spoken young woman to walk 15 miles through wilderness, alone and desperate enough to risk her life. And wondering, even more troublingly, why he cared. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the cabin windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-clean world of glistening drops on pine needles and puddles reflecting blue sky. Luke had risen before dawn, as was his habit, careful not to disturb his sleeping guest. He'd tended to thunder, checked his small herd of cattle, and was returning with fresh milk when Penelope emerged from the cabin. She donned her own clothes again, now mostly dry, her hair neatly pinned beneath her bonnet. Only the mud-caked boots, still damp, ruined the picture of Eastern propriety. Good morning, she called, shielding her eyes against the bright sunshine. I was beginning to think you'd abandoned me. Chores don't wait, Luke replied, carrying the milk pail toward the cabin. Not even for unexpected guests. Penelope followed him inside, where he poured some of the milk into a pot to heat. I can make breakfast, she offered. It seems only fair, given your hospitality. Luke hesitated, then nodded toward the small cupboard. There's cornmeal and some salt pork, coffee's in the tin. He watched with surprise as she moved confidently around his kitchen space, finding what she needed without asking, building up the fire in the stove with practiced motions. Not the helpless city girl he'd initially judged her to be. You've cooked over a wood stove before, he observed. Penelope glanced up as she sliced salt pork. I grew up in Pennsylvania farm country, Mr. O'Malley. We weren't wealthy enough for servants. This was the first real detail she'd offered about herself. How does a Pennsylvania farm girl end up walking alone through Wyoming Territory? Her hand stilled momentarily before continuing their work. Life rarely follows the paths we expect, does it? No, Luke agreed, thinking of his own journey. It rarely does. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, cornmeal mush with milk and fried salt pork. Luke had to admit the simple fare tasted better than when he prepared it himself. What are your plans now? He asked as they finished eating. Penelope dabbed at her lips with a cloth napkin she'd produced from her bag. I need to find work and lodging in town. What kind of work? I can teach. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history. I was a school teacher back east. She hesitated. I can also cook, clean, sew, whatever's needed. Luke considered this. Laramie's school already has a teacher, old Miss Perkins. Been there 20 years and likely to stay another 20. He saw disappointment flicker across Penelope's face before she masked it. But there are families outside town who might hire a tutor for their children. And the hotel sometimes needs help. The hotel would be ideal, she said, brightening. Is it far from town? On Main Street, can't miss it. Penelope began gathering the breakfast dishes. Then that's where I'll start. If you could point me in the right direction, I'll be on my way. Luke frowned. It's 5 miles to town. I walked 15 yesterday, she reminded him with a small smile. 5 seems quite manageable in comparison. I'm heading that way myself, Luke found himself saying. Need supplies, I can give you a ride. The relief in her eyes betrayed her bravado. That would be most appreciated, Mr. O'Malley. As they rode toward Laramie, thunder carrying them at an easy pace, Luke found himself unusually aware of his passenger. Unlike the previous night's desperate journey, today Penelope sat straight-backed behind him, her hands resting lightly at his waist, only tightening when the horse negotiated a particularly muddy stretch of road. How long have you lived in Wyoming Territory? She asked as they crested a small rise that offered a view of Laramie in the distance. 7 years, Luke replied, came west after the war. You fought in the war between the states. Luke nodded. Union side, was barely 18 when I enlisted, saw things no man should see. My father and brother fought as well, Penelope said softly. Father came home, Edward didn't. Luke remained silent, recognizing the grief in her voice. So many families bore similar wounds, empty chairs at tables, names no longer spoken aloud, photographs carefully preserved as memories faded. The West seemed like a place to start fresh, he said finally. That's why I came too, Penelope admitted, to leave the past behind. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in private thoughts. As they approached the outskirts of Laramie, activity increased, wagons moving along the main road, riders passing with nods of greeting toward Luke, curious glances at his companion. Where should I leave you? Luke asked as they entered the town proper. Penelope straightened her bonnet. The hotel, if you wouldn't mind. Luke guided Thunder down Main Street, past the general store, the blacksmith shop, and the newly constructed bank building. Laramie was growing, attracting more settlers and businesses each year as the railroad brought increased commerce. The Grand Hotel stood 3 stories tall, its painted sign proclaiming it the finest accommodations in Wyoming Territory. Luke helped Penelope dismount in front of the building. Thank you for everything, Mr. O'Malley, she said, extending her hand formally. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been at that saloon last night. Luke took her hand briefly. You'd have managed. You seem the type. A genuine smile lit her face, transforming her from merely pretty to strikingly beautiful. Nevertheless, I'm grateful. Something unfamiliar tugged at Luke's chest, an unwelcome pull toward this woman with her proper speech and mud-caked boots. He stepped back, tipping his hat. Good luck, Miss Sinclair. He was turning to mount Thunder when Penelope's voice stopped him. Mr. O'Malley, might I call on you sometime? To repay your kindness properly. The proper response would be to decline, to cut this tenuous connection before it strengthened. Luke had survived by keeping people at a distance, and yet. My place is the small cabin with the split-rail fence 3 miles west of town, he found himself saying. You're welcome any time. Her smile widened. Thank you, I'll remember that. As Luke rode away toward the general store, he felt uncharacteristically lightheaded. as though he'd just done something monumental rather than simply offered a neighborly invitation. He shook his head to clear it. He'd probably never see Penelope Sinclair again. Laramie had a way of swallowing newcomers, especially women, alone. She'd find work, make connections, build a life that didn't intersect with his solitary existence. It was better that way, safer. 3 days passed before Luke returned to Laramie, driven by the need for additional supplies, and though he was reluctant to admit it, curiosity about how the Eastern schoolteacher was faring. He conducted his business at the general store with his usual efficiency, loading supplies onto Thunder's back. "O'Malley," a voice called as he was preparing to leave town. Luke turned to see Sheriff Dawson approaching, his weathered face creased with concern. "Sheriff. Heard you helped a young lady during that storm the other night," Dawson said without preamble. Luke tensed. "News travels fast." "Small town," the sheriff agreed. "Blonde girl, pretty Eastern manners." "What about her?" Dawson glanced around before lowering his voice. "There's a man asking after her, arrived on yesterday's stage from Cheyenne. Well-dressed fellow, says he's her husband." A cold weight settled in Luke's gut. Husband. Claims she ran off with family valuables, wants her returned to his custody. The sheriff studied Luke's face. "You know anything about that?" "She never mentioned a husband," Luke said carefully. Dawson scratched his chin. "Well, she's working at the hotel now, chambermaid, seems a decent sort." "Quiet." "This man," Luke asked, "what's his name?" "Victor Harrington, says he's from Philadelphia, has papers that look legitimate enough, wedding certificate, property deeds." The sheriff's expression revealed nothing. "Asked me to bring her in if I located her." Luke's fingers tightened on Thunder's reins. "And will you?" Dawson shrugged. "Haven't seen her yet, just thought you might want to know, given you helped her and all." The implication was clear. The sheriff was giving Luke a chance to warn Penelope should he choose to. "Appreciate the information," Luke said neutrally. Dawson nodded once, then turned back toward his office. Luke stood motionless for a long moment, weighing his options. This wasn't his problem. If Penelope Sinclair or Harrington apparently had fled her husband, that was her business. Domestic disputes were dangerous territory best avoided. And yet, the image of mud-caked boots and desperate green eyes floated before him, the determination with which she'd walked 15 miles through wilderness, the steel beneath her refined manner. With a muttered curse, Luke secured his supplies and headed toward the Grand Hotel. The lobby was quiet when he entered, only a few travelers occupying the leather chairs scattered about the space. A balding clerk looked up from the registration desk with a practiced smile. "Room for the night, sir." "Looking for one of your employees," Luke replied. "Miss Sinclair." The clerk's smile faltered. "Are you a relative?" "Friend," Luke said shortly. "Is she here?" "Upstairs, cleaning rooms," the clerk hesitated. "Are you aware there's a gentleman looking for her, her husband, I believe?" So Harrington had already made inquiries here. "I heard, mind if I go up?" The clerk looked uncertain. "We don't usually allow visitors to the guest floors without." "It's important," Luke interrupted. "Which room is she in?" "Third floor, east wing." Rooms 301 through 306 were on her schedule this morning. Luke took the stairs 2 at a time, his boots echoing on the polished wood. The third-floor corridor stretched before him, doors spaced evenly along both sides. A cleaning cart stood outside room 304, and as Luke approached, he heard soft humming from within. He knocked lightly, then pushed the door open without waiting for a response. Penelope stood by the window, a feather duster in her hand, wearing a simple gray dress with a white apron, the hotel's chambermaid uniform. She turned at the sound of the door, her expression changing from professional politeness to shock when she saw him. "Mr. O'Malley." Luke closed the door behind him. "We need to talk." She set down the duster, a wariness entering her posture. "Has something happened?" "Your husband is in town." The color drained from her face so rapidly that Luke moved forward, concerned she might faint. But Penelope remained upright, her fingers clutching the bedpost for support. "Victor is here, in Laramie," her voice had dropped to a whisper. "Arrived yesterday, he's talking to the sheriff, saying you stole from him." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Of course he is. Is it true, are you married to him?" Penelope's eyes met his, desperation plain in their green depths. "Yes, but it's not what you think. I didn't steal anything except myself." "You'd better explain," Luke said, crossing his arms. "And quickly." She sank onto the edge of the bed. I married Victor Harrington 2 years ago. He seemed kind, respectable, everything a woman is taught to look for in a husband, but once we were wed, her voice faltered, he changed. Or perhaps he simply stopped pretending. He hurt you, Luke stated, reading between the lines. Penelope nodded, her gaze fixed on her hands. At first it was just words, criticism, constant belittling. Then he began to control everything, whom I saw, where I went, what I wore, and finally, she touched her collar bone through the fabric of her dress, a gesture Luke suspected was unconscious. The beating started. Always where it wouldn't show, always followed by apologies and gifts. Anger flared in Luke's chest, hot and unfamiliar. Why didn't you leave sooner? Where would I go? He controlled all our money. My family is gone. Father died last year, mother years before that. Victor made sure I had no friends left. Bitterness tinged her words, and in Philadelphia society, a husband's treatment of his wife is considered a private matter. So what changed? Penelope's expression hardened. I discovered I was with child. Luke's eyebrows rose in surprise. I lost the baby after Victor pushed me down the stairs during an argument, she continued, her voice flat. The doctor told me I would likely never conceive again. That night, I decided I would rather die trying to escape than live one more day under Victor's control. So you ran? She nodded. I took my mother's jewelry, the only items that were truly mine by inheritance, though Victor considered them his property. I sold them piece by piece as I traveled west, changing direction whenever I feared he was close. Luke paced the small room, processing her story. And the stagecoach breaking down, walking to Laramie in that storm. I'd heard rumors he had men watching the stagecoach stops, Penelope explained. When we broke down at Miller's Crossing, I overheard the driver mention that a man had been asking about a woman matching my description in Cheyenne. I couldn't risk waiting for morning. So you walked 15 miles through wilderness alone? Luke shook his head in disbelief. You could have died out there. I would rather have died free than live another day as Victor Harrington's possession, she replied with quiet dignity. Luke stopped pacing, studying her face. There was no deception there, only fear and determination in equal measure. Everything about her story aligned with the woman he'd observed, the desperate journey, the mud-caked boots, the wariness in her eyes. We need to get you out of Laramie, he said decisively. If he's talking to the sheriff, it won't be long before he tracks you here. Hope flickered in Penelope's eyes. You believe me. I've seen enough of men like your husband to recognize the type, Luke replied grimly. Finish your work day normally. Don't give anyone reason to suspect you know he's here. I'll come for you after dark. Where will we go? The we hung between them, a connection neither had anticipated but both now acknowledged. Luke had spent 5 years avoiding entanglements, and yet here he was, preparing to involve himself in a stranger's dangerous situation. I have a friend with a ranch near Cheyenne, he said after a moment's thought. He owes me a favor. You can stay there until we figure out what to do next. Penelope rose from the bed, straightening her apron with trembling hands. Why are you helping me, Mr. O'Malley? You don't know me. This isn't your fight. It was a fair question, one Luke had been asking himself since entering the hotel. The answer came to him with unexpected clarity, because 5 years ago when I needed help, no one came. The admission cost him, but Penelope deserved honesty. I won't be that person, the one who turns away. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Thank you. Be ready at midnight, Luke instructed, moving toward the door. Pack only what you can carry easily. I'll meet you behind the hotel. As he reached for the doorknob, Penelope called softly, Mr. O'Malley. He turned. You can call me Penny, my friends used to. The simple offer of familiarity, of connection, struck Luke more forcefully than he'd expected. Luke, he replied, just Luke. Midnight found Luke concealed in the shadows behind the Grand Hotel, Thunder saddled and ready nearby. He'd spent the afternoon making preparations, provisions, a spare horse borrowed from a neighbor, a plan for reaching his friend's ranch without taking the main roads. Movement at the hotel's back door caught his attention. Penelope emerged, a small bundle in one hand, glancing nervously over her shoulder. She wore her traveling dress again, with a dark shawl pulled over her head to obscure her distinctive blonde hair. Luke stepped from the shadows. Over here. Penelope hurried toward him, relief evident in her posture. I was afraid you wouldn't come. Said I would, didn't I? Luke took her bundle, securing it to the saddle of the spare horse, a gentle mare named Daisy. I had a visitor this afternoon, Penelope whispered. The hotel manager said a gentleman was asking about me, wanted to know my schedule. Luke's jaw tightened. We need to move quickly then. Can you ride alone? She nodded. It's been some time, but yes. Luke helped her mount Daisy, giving her a moment to adjust to the saddle before mounting Thunder himself. Stay close. We'll keep to the trees until we're clear of town. They rode in silence, guided by moonlight, following a narrow trail that paralleled the main road at a distance. Luke remained alert, scanning their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. Behind him, Penelope rode with surprising skill, keeping pace without complaint despite the difficult terrain. After an hour, when Laramie was well behind them, Luke guided them to a small clearing beside a creek. We'll rest the horses briefly, he said, dismounting. Penelope slid from her saddle, wincing slightly as her feet touched the ground. I'm not used to riding anymore, she admitted with a rueful smile. Victor considered it unladylike. Luke led the horses to drink from the creek. Your husband doesn't sound like much of a judge of character. No, she agreed, rubbing her lower back. He preferred women ornamental and obedient. I was neither, as it turned out. There was strength in her quiet statement, pride even. Luke found himself admiring it. Most women who'd endured what she had would be broken. Penelope Sinclair had been bent, perhaps, but not broken. How much further to your friend's ranch? She asked, accepting the canteen Luke offered. 3 days' ride, keeping to the back country. Penelope's eyes widened. 3 days. I thought Cheyenne was much closer. It is by the main road, Luke explained. But that's the first place they'll look for you. We need to circle around, avoid settlements. She absorbed this information with a thoughtful nod. Will your cattle be all right, being left alone for so long? The question surprised him. Few people, especially Eastern women, would think to ask about his livelihood at a time like this. My neighbor Jenkins will check on them. We have an arrangement. They continued their journey through the night, making use of the full moon's illumination. By dawn, they had covered nearly 20 miles and were deep in the foothills that marked the eastern boundary of the Laramie Range. Luke found a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging cliff, partially screened by pines, a natural hideaway where they could rest during daylight hours when travel would be riskier. We'll stay here until dusk, he said, helping Penelope dismount. Get some sleep if you can. While she stretched her limbs, wincing at muscles unaccustomed to long hours in the saddle, Luke tended the horses and organized their supplies. He'd packed enough food for several days: jerky, hardtack, coffee, dried apples, simple fare but sufficient. Here, he said, offering Penelope a strip of jerky and a biscuit. It's not much, but it'll keep you going. She accepted the food with gratitude. I've had worse. During my journey west, I often went without eating for a day or more. Luke settled against a fallen log, watching as she ate with delicate but efficient bites. Tell me about your journey, he said, surprising himself with the request. How did you get from Philadelphia to Wyoming Territory? Penelope hesitated, then began speaking, her voice low and measured. She described slipping away during a dinner party at their home, taking only what she could carry in a small valise. She'd traveled by train at first, zigzagging across the country, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked. I taught piano lessons in Chicago for 3 weeks, she recalled. Then worked as a seamstress in St. Louis. Every time I thought I was safe, something would happen, a telegram inquiry at the hotel, a stranger asking questions, and I'd have to move on. How did you choose Laramie? Luke asked. A small smile curved her lips. I didn't really. I was heading for San Francisco, but my funds were running low. I saw an advertisement in a Denver newspaper, teachers needed in Wyoming Territory. It seemed as good a destination as any. Luke nodded. The West was full of people who'd arrived by similar circumstance, not so much drawn to the frontier as pushed toward it by necessity or desperation. As the day progressed, they took turns keeping watch while the other rested. Luke found himself studying Penelope as she slept, noting the way tension eased from her features, making her appear even younger. She couldn't be more than 21 or 22, hardly more than a girl, really, despite her composure and determination. When dusk fell, they resumed their journey, following game trails through increasingly rugged terrain. Luke set a careful pace, mindful of the horses and Penelope's comfort, though she made no complaint despite what must have been considerable discomfort after so many hours in the saddle. They continued this pattern for 2 more days, traveling by night, resting during daylight hours in concealed locations. Luke found himself increasingly impressed by Penelope's resilience. She adapted quickly to their rough circumstances, learning to help with camp tasks without being asked, maintaining a quiet dignity even when washing in cold streams or eating unappetizing trail food. More surprising was the ease that developed between them. Their conversations, initially sparse and practical, gradually expanded to include personal histories and observations. Luke found himself sharing stories he'd told no one, about his childhood in Missouri, his experiences during the war, his journey west after his parents were killed in a raid. "Is that why you live alone?" Penelope asked on their third night as they sat beside a small, well-concealed fire. "Because of what happened to your family?" Luke poked at the embers with a stick, partly. "Losing them showed me how dangerous attachments can be. When you care about people, you give life a hostage. Yet here you are helping me," she observed, "a stranger." "Maybe I'm not as smart as I thought," he replied with a wry smile. Penelope's laugh, a genuine sound of amusement that he'd heard increasingly over their journey, warmed something within him that had been cold for years. "Or maybe," she suggested, "you're simply a good man, Luke O'Malley, despite your best efforts to convince yourself otherwise." Before he could formulate a response to this unsettling observation, a distant sound caught Luke's attention. He raised a hand, silencing further conversation, and listened intently. Hoofbeats, multiple riders moving at a deliberate pace. "Douse the fire," he whispered urgently. "Quickly." Penelope moved without question, scooping dirt onto the small flames while Luke gathered their belongings and led the horses deeper into the trees. They crouched in the underbrush, scarcely breathing as the riders drew closer. Three men on horseback moved along the trail they had been following earlier, their silhouettes visible in the moonlight. They rode slowly, clearly searching for signs of recent passage. "Spread out," one of them called. "The tracks lead this way." Luke's hand moved to the revolver at his hip. Beside him, Penelope trembled slightly but remained silent, her eyes wide in the darkness. The riders separated, one continuing along the trail while the others fanned out through the trees. One came dangerously close to their hiding place, his horse snorting softly as it picked its way through the underbrush. Luke tensed, preparing to draw his weapon if discovered. The rider paused, scanning the surroundings, then called out, "Nothing here, trail's gone cold." "We'll try again at first light," the leader responded. "They can't have gotten far on foot." On foot, Luke frowned. They thought Penelope was alone and without transportation. It was a small advantage, but one he intended to use. The riders regrouped and continued along the trail, eventually disappearing into the night. Luke waited a full 30 minutes after the last hoofbeat faded before moving. "Those were Victor's men," Penelope whispered, her voice strained. "He hired them in Philadelphia, former Pinkerton agents who left the agency under questionable circumstances. They've been tracking me for months." "They think you're on foot," Luke noted. "That gives us an edge. But we need to change our route." He studied the stars, orienting himself. "There's an old trapper's path that cuts through the mountains. It's rough going, but if we push hard, we can reach my friend's ranch by tomorrow night." Penelope straightened, squaring her shoulders. "Then let's push hard." The new route proved even more challenging than Luke had anticipated. The trail, little more than a deer path in places, wound through steep ravines and dense forest, requiring them to dismount and lead the horses through the most treacherous sections. Penelope followed without complaint, though Luke could see the toll the journey was taking. Her hands were scratched from brush, her face drawn with exhaustion. Still, determination burned in her eyes whenever he caught her gaze. By midday, they had crossed the most difficult terrain and found themselves descending toward a valley Luke recognized. "We're close now," he said as they paused to water the horses at a small spring. "Another few hours' ride." Penelope slumped against a boulder, fatigue evident in every line of her body. "Will your friend truly help us, someone he's never met?" "Frank Miller and I served together during the war," Luke explained. "Saved each other's lives more than once. His wife Sarah is good people too." He hesitated. "It's not just the ranch that makes it a good hiding place. Frank's brother is a judge in Cheyenne. He might be able to help with your situation legally." Hope flickered in Penelope's eyes. "You think that's possible?" "Don't know," Luke admitted, "but it's worth trying. The law regarding marriage is changing slowly. Some states are allowing divorces in cases of cruelty." They mounted again, continuing their journey as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley. Luke found himself increasingly conscious of what awaited them at journey's end. Once Penelope was safely delivered to the Miller ranch, his obligation would be fulfilled. He would return to his solitary cabin, his small herd of cattle, his carefully constructed isolation. The thought brought none of the comfort it once might have. As dusk approached, they crested a rise that offered a view of their destination, a sprawling ranch nestled against the foothills, with a main house, several outbuildings, and corrals containing horses and cattle. "The Circle M," Luke announced, "Frank Miller's place." Relief washed over Penelope's face. "We made it." Their arrival caused immediate activity at the ranch. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a graying beard emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, as they approached the main house. Recognition dawned on his weathered face. "Luke O'Malley, as I live and breathe," he called, lowering his weapon. "What brings you to my doorstep looking like you've been dragged through half of Wyoming?" Luke dismounted, extending his hand to his old friend. "Frank, good to see you. We need your help." Frank's gaze shifted to Penelope, who remained on her horse, uncertainty plain in her posture. "I can see that," he said quietly. "Come inside. Sarah's just putting supper on." The Miller home was everything Luke remembered, warm, welcoming, filled with the evidence of a life well lived. Sarah Miller, a capable woman with kind eyes and practical hands, took one look at Penelope and immediately set about providing for her comfort. "You poor dear," she exclaimed, ushering Penelope toward the washroom. "You look dead on your feet. Let's get you cleaned up and into some fresh clothes before you fall over." While the women were occupied, Luke explained the situation to Frank in the study, outlining Penelope's circumstances and the pursuit they'd narrowly evaded. Frank listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grim. When Luke finished, he reached for a bottle of whiskey and poured 2 generous glasses. "Damn shame," he said, passing one to Luke, "but not uncommon. The law gives husbands too much power and wives too little protection." He took a thoughtful sip. "My brother might be able to help. James has progressive views on these matters. I can send word to him tomorrow." Luke nodded gratefully. "That's all I ask, a chance for her to get a fair hearing." Frank studied him with knowing eyes. "This is more than a random act of kindness on your part, isn't it, Luke?" Luke shifted uncomfortably. "She needed help. I was there." Frank's skepticism was evident. "And you've spent 3 days evading armed men to deliver a woman you've known less than a week to my doorstep because—" "Because it was the right thing to do," Luke insisted, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Frank's smile was knowing but kind. "If you say so, but I've known you a long time, O'Malley. You don't get involved without reason." Before Luke could formulate a response, Sarah entered with Penelope. The transformation was remarkable, clean, dressed in borrowed clothes that fit her slender frame reasonably well. Her blonde hair neatly braided, Penelope looked like a different woman than the exhausted traveler who had arrived on their doorstep. "Feel better, my dear?" Frank asked kindly. "Immeasurably," Penelope replied with a grateful smile toward Sarah. "Your wife has been extraordinarily kind." "Kindness costs nothing," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "Now both of you sit down to supper before it gets cold." The meal was the finest Luke had eaten in months: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, vegetables from Sarah's garden. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until the food was before him. Beside him, Penelope ate with similar appreciation, though her manners remained impeccable even in her hunger. Conversation flowed easily, with Frank and Sarah carefully avoiding sensitive topics, focusing instead on ranch news and local gossip. It was only when the meal concluded that Frank brought up their situation again. "I've been thinking about your problem, Miss Sinclair," he said. "If you're agreeable, I'll ride into Cheyenne tomorrow and speak with my brother. James might be able to arrange a hearing before a territorial judge." Penelope set down her coffee cup. "Would such a hearing be effective? My husband has considerable influence." "In Philadelphia, perhaps," Frank acknowledged. "But out here, things work differently. James has been advocating for changes in the marriage laws. He's helped other women in similar situations." Hope and doubt warred in Penelope's expression. Even if a territorial judge granted a divorce, would it be recognized back east? "That's a question for James," Frank admitted, "but in the meantime, you're welcome to stay here. Our ranch is well protected, and everyone who works for us is loyal." "Thank you," Penelope said softly. "Your generosity is overwhelming." Sarah reached across the table to pat her hand. "Nonsense. Any friend of Luke's is family to us." Luke felt a twinge of discomfort at the assumption. He and Penelope were hardly friends in the traditional sense, more like allies thrown together by circumstance. Yet as he looked at her across the table, their shared journey seemed to have forged a connection deeper than mere acquaintance. After supper, Frank showed them to guest rooms in the spacious ranch house. Luke found himself standing awkwardly in the hallway with Penelope after their hosts had retired. "You'll be safe here," he said, breaking the silence. Penelope nodded, her eyes searching his face. "When will you leave?" The question caught him off guard. "First light, I suppose." "My herd needs tending." Of course, was there disappointment in her voice, or was he imagining it? Luke shifted his weight, suddenly uncertain. 5 years of careful isolation hadn't prepared him for the complexities of human connection, for the way Penelope's presence had somehow become significant to him in ways he couldn't articulate. "I could stay another day," he found himself saying. "Meet Frank's brother, hear what he has to say." Relief flickered in her eyes. "I would appreciate that. Your insight has proven valuable." It was a rational explanation for his continued presence, and Luke seized upon it gratefully. "Then I'll stay until we've spoken with Judge Miller." Penelope smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely pretty to luminous. "Thank you, Luke, for everything." Before he could respond, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, then disappeared into her room, leaving Luke standing in the hallway, his hand raised to the spot her lips had touched. Judge James Miller arrived the following afternoon, having ridden directly from Cheyenne upon receiving his brother's message. He was a distinguished man in his 50s, with the same solid build as Frank but a more formal bearing befitting his position. After introductions and a brief meal, they gathered in Frank's study to discuss Penelope's situation. Judge Miller listened attentively as she recounted her marriage and subsequent flight, asking occasional questions but mostly allowing her to speak uninterrupted. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Your situation is unfortunately common, Mrs. Harrington, but your options are limited by current law." "Please call me Miss Sinclair," Penelope requested quietly. "I no longer consider myself bound to that name." The judge nodded. "As you wish. The difficulty lies in the legal status of marriage. While some states have begun recognizing cruelty as grounds for divorce, the burden of proof is substantial, and your husband's resources give him significant advantage." Luke, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, leaned forward. "There must be something that can be done. She can't go back to him." "I agree," Judge Miller said, "and I believe there may be a path forward, though it's not without risk." He turned to Penelope. "Wyoming Territory is at the forefront of women's rights. Our territorial legislature is considering measures that would grant women more legal protections, including expanded grounds for divorce." Hope flickered in Penelope's eyes. "How long before such measures might pass?" "Months, perhaps a year," the judge admitted. "But in the meantime, we can file for legal separation and petition for protection. If your husband attempts to force your return, he would be violating territorial law." "Would such protection extend beyond Wyoming?" Luke asked. "No," Judge Miller acknowledged. "Which is why I recommend you remain here, under my brother's protection, until we can secure a more permanent solution." Penelope absorbed this information, her expression thoughtful. "And if Victor comes himself?" "He's not a man who accepts defeat easily." "Then he'll find himself facing the full force of territorial law," Judge Miller stated firmly. "I have some influence in these matters, Miss Sinclair. I promise you won't face him alone." The discussion continued into the evening, with Judge Miller outlining the legal steps they would take and the precautions necessary to ensure Penelope's safety. Throughout, Luke found himself increasingly invested in the outcome, his original plan to return to his cabin the next day forgotten as each new detail of the legal strategy emerged. It was only when the judge prepared to depart, promising to begin legal proceedings immediately, that Luke confronted the reality of his situation. His obligation to Penelope had been fulfilled. She was safe, with powerful allies and a clear path forward. There was no logical reason for him to remain involved, yet as he watched her thank Judge Miller, her face animated with newfound hope, Luke knew he couldn't simply walk away. Something fundamental had shifted within him during their journey together, a crack in the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself. That evening, after their hosts had retired, Luke found Penelope on the porch, gazing at the star-filled sky. "Penny," he said softly, using the familiar name she'd offered days ago. She turned, a small smile playing at her lips. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd forgotten I gave you permission to use that name." Luke moved to stand beside her at the railing. I haven't forgotten anything about the past few days. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the night sounds of the ranch, distant cattle, the occasional whinny of horses, crickets in the tall grass, creating a peaceful backdrop. Judge Miller seems confident he can help you, Luke observed finally. Penelope nodded. More than I dared hope for. A year ago I couldn't imagine a path to freedom. Now it seems almost within reach. What will you do afterward? When it's all settled legally? She considered the question. Teach perhaps, or find other work. I've learned I'm more capable than I once believed. She glanced at him. What about you? Will you return to your solitary cabin and pretend none of this happened? The direct question caught him off guard. I don't know, he admitted. A week ago I would have said yes without hesitation. Now, now, she prompted when he didn't continue. Luke struggled to articulate the unfamiliar emotions churning within him. Now I'm not sure isolation is what I want anymore. Penelope turned to face him fully. What do you want, Luke? The moonlight silvered her honey-blonde hair, illuminating the delicate curve of her cheek, the questioning arch of her brow. Luke had spent 5 years avoiding connection, believing it led only to pain and loss. Yet in the span of a few days, this woman had somehow breached his defenses, awakening feelings he'd thought long buried. I want to see what happens next, he said simply. With you, with this. He gestured vaguely between them. I'm not good at this, Penny, talking about feelings, being close to someone. I've spent years making sure I didn't have to be. Her expression softened. I understand that better than most, I think. Victor made me afraid to trust, afraid to hope for kindness. She paused. But you showed me kindness when you had no reason to. You risked your safety for mine. You would have done the same, Luke said with certainty. Perhaps. A small smile played at her lips. Though I might not have been quite so gruff about it. Luke found himself returning her smile, the tension easing from his shoulders. So what happens now? I think, Penelope said carefully, that we see what develops, one day at a time. Without expectations or demands, she hesitated. Could you be content with that, just discovering what might be possible between us? It was more than Luke had allowed himself to consider in years, the possibility of connection, of vulnerability, of a future that included someone else. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. I could try, he offered honestly. Penelope's smile widened. Then that's where we'll begin. The days that followed took on an unexpected rhythm. Luke sent word to his neighbor Jenkins to continue watching his herd, while he remained at the Circle M, ostensibly to help Frank with ranch work while they awaited news from Judge Miller. In reality, he found himself drawn into Penelope's orbit, their days filled with shared activities and conversations that gradually revealed the deeper layers of their personalities. He taught her to shoot a rifle, a skill she mastered with surprising aptitude. She introduced him to poetry, reading aloud in the evenings from books in the Miller's library. Frank and Sarah watched their developing friendship with knowing smiles but refrained from comment, simply including both Luke and Penelope in the daily life of the ranch as though they had always been there. 2 weeks after their arrival, Judge Miller returned with news. Victor Harrington had indeed tracked Penelope to Wyoming Territory and had filed formal demands for her return with authorities in Cheyenne. He's staying at the Cheyenne House Hotel, the judge informed them grimly. With 3 men I strongly suspect are the ones who pursued you through the mountains. Luke's hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip. Has he made any move toward the ranch? Not yet, but he's been asking questions, offering rewards for information. Judge Miller's expression was serious. The good news is that I've filed preliminary papers for legal separation on grounds of cruelty. The territorial court has granted temporary protection, prohibiting him from approaching or attempting to remove Miss Sinclair by force. Penelope's face paled. Will that stop him? Legally, yes. Practically, the judge shrugged. Men like Harrington often believe themselves above the law. Then we'll need to be prepared for trouble, Frank said matter-of-factly. I'll alert the ranch hands. Luke caught Penelope's eye across the room, reading the fear she tried to conceal. He won't get to you, he promised quietly, not while I'm here. Judge Miller departed with assurances that the legal process was moving forward as quickly as possible. In his wake, the atmosphere at the ranch shifted subtly. Ranch hands began carrying rifles during their rounds, and Frank instituted night watches around the perimeter of the property. 3 days later, the confrontation they had feared arrived. Luke was helping Frank repair a section of fence when one of the ranch hands galloped up, his horse lathered with exertion. "Riders coming," he reported breathlessly. "Four men, well-dressed leader. They're demanding to speak with you, Mr. Miller." Frank and Luke exchanged glances. "Get back to the house," Frank ordered the young cowboy. "Tell Sarah to keep Miss Sinclair inside and out of sight." As the ranch hand rode off, Frank turned to Luke. "Sounds like your Harrington has decided to pay us a visit." "He's not mine," Luke replied grimly, checking his revolver before sliding it back into its holster. "But I'll handle him." They mounted their horses and rode toward the main gate, arriving just as four riders approached the property line. Even at a distance, Luke could identify the leader, a tall man in expensive Eastern clothing, sitting his horse with the stiff posture of someone unaccustomed to extended riding. "That's far enough," Frank called as the riders neared the gate. "State your business." The well-dressed man urged his horse forward. Up close, Victor Harrington was handsome in a conventional way, well-groomed, with aristocratic features and cold eyes that assessed Frank and Luke with obvious disdain. "I'm looking for my wife," he stated without preamble. "I have reason to believe she's being harbored on this property." "Don't know any Mrs. Harrington," Frank replied easily. "This is a working ranch." "No place for Eastern ladies." Victor's mouth tightened. "Perhaps you know her by her maiden name, Penelope Sinclair. Young woman, blonde hair, green eyes. She's been missing from our Philadelphia home for nearly 6 months." "Can't help you," Frank said with convincing regret. "Haven't seen anyone fitting that description." Victor's gaze shifted to Luke, recognition dawning in his eyes. "You, the cowboy from Laramie, clerk at the hotel, said you were asking after my wife right before she disappeared." His hand moved toward the inside of his coat. Luke's revolver appeared in his hand with practiced speed. "I wouldn't," he advised quietly. Harrington froze, fury contorting his features. "You have no right to interfere in my personal affairs." "That woman is my legal wife, and I demand her return." "That woman," Luke replied, his voice dangerously soft, "has the right to live without fear of being beaten. She has the protection of Wyoming territorial law now." "She's a liar and a thief," Harrington spat. "Whatever story she's told you is fabricated to gain your sympathy." "I've seen the bruises," Luke countered. "I've heard consistent accounts from multiple sources, and Judge James Miller believes her enough to file for legal separation on her behalf." The mention of the judge's name caused visible consternation among Harrington's men, though Victor himself maintained his composure. "This is absurd," he declared. "I demand to see her, to hear these accusations from her own lips." "That's not happening," Frank stated flatly. "Miss Sinclair has made her wishes clear. She doesn't want to see you." Victor's face darkened. "She doesn't have a choice, the law." "The law in Wyoming Territory," Luke interrupted, "grants her the right to protection from a husband who abuses her. Judge Miller has already issued the order. You approach her, you'll be arrested." For a moment it seemed Victor might order his men to force their way onto the property. Then, with visible effort, he controlled his anger. "This isn't over," he stated coldly. "I have connections in Washington. Your territorial judge won't have the final say." "Maybe not," Frank agreed amiably. "But today his word is law, and his word says you stay away from Penelope Sinclair." Victor's gaze locked with Luke's, hatred evident in every line of his face. "You'll regret interfering in matters that don't concern you, cowboy." "I only regret not putting a bullet in you when I had the chance," Luke replied evenly. With a final glare, Victor wheeled his horse around and signaled his men to follow. They watched until the riders disappeared over the ridge before turning back toward the ranch house. "That man's going to be trouble," Frank observed. Luke nodded grimly. "Count on it." Penelope was waiting on the porch when they returned, her face pale but composed. "Was it him?" "Yes," Luke confirmed, dismounting, "but he's gone for now." She nodded, twisting her hands together. "Did he say what he plans to do next?" "Made some vague threats about connections in Washington," Frank replied, leading his horse toward the barn. "Nothing specific." When Frank had gone, Luke joined Penelope on the porch. "Are you all right?" "I thought I would be more frightened," she admitted, "seeing him again after all this time, but mostly I feel," she paused, searching for the word, "resolute. I won't go back to that life." "Not ever." Luke studied her face, finding no trace of the fearful woman who had arrived at the saloon that stormy night. In her place stood someone stronger, still delicate in appearance, but with a core of steel that adversity had tempered rather than broken. "You won't have to," he promised. "We'll find a way through this." Penelope's smile was small but genuine. A word I'd almost forgotten could exist. That night, a writer arrived from Cheyenne with an urgent message from Judge Miller. Victor Harrington had indeed sent telegrams to powerful connections in Washington, and there was concern that federal authorities might intervene in what the judge considered a territorial matter. James suggests we accelerate our plan, Frank told them after reading the message. He wants to bring Penelope before the territorial court immediately, while he still has jurisdiction. When, Luke asked, tomorrow first light. Penelope's face paled. So soon. Will I have to face Victor? Possibly, Frank admitted, but you'll have the protection of the court, and us, he added with a significant look at Luke. They departed for Cheyenne before dawn, traveling in Frank's covered wagon for Penelope's safety and comfort. Luke rode alongside, scanning their surroundings constantly for any sign of pursuit. They reached the territorial capital by mid-afternoon without incident, proceeding directly to Judge Miller's chambers in the courthouse. The judge met them personally, his expression grave. I've scheduled a hearing for tomorrow morning, he informed them after greetings were exchanged. Harrington has been notified as required by law. He'll be there with legal representation. Penelope nodded, her composure admirable despite the circumstances. What should I expect? You'll need to testify about your marriage and the reasons you left, Judge Miller explained. Be specific about instances of cruelty, dates, circumstances, witnesses if possible. There were no witnesses, Penelope said softly. Victor was careful about that. Then we'll rely on your testimony and character witnesses, the judge assured her. I've arranged for Dr. Martin to examine you this afternoon. Any evidence of past injuries will strengthen your case. Luke remained silent during these discussions, acutely aware that he had no legal standing in the proceedings. Yet when Judge Miller suggested Penelope stay at his home overnight for safety, Luke found himself reluctant to leave her side. I'll be fine, she assured him when they had a moment alone. Sarah will stay with me, and the judge's home is well guarded. Luke nodded, knowing she was right but uncomfortable nonetheless. I don't trust Harrington. He strikes me as a man who doesn't accept defeat easily. Nor does he, Penelope agreed, but for the first time I'm not facing him alone. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. You've given me that gift, Luke. The knowledge that I'm not alone anymore. The simple touch and heartfelt words affected Luke more deeply than he would have expected. I'll be at the courthouse tomorrow, he promised. First row. The hearing began at 9 o'clock the following morning in the territorial courthouse's main chamber. Luke arrived early, securing a seat directly behind where Penelope would sit with Judge Miller's appointed lawyer, a capable young woman named Margaret Thorne who specialized in cases involving women's rights. The courtroom filled quickly, local residents curious about the unusual case, reporters from the territorial newspaper, and finally Victor Harrington, accompanied by a distinguished-looking attorney and his 3 ever-present men. When their eyes met across the room, Victor's expression darkened with hatred. Luke returned his gaze steadily, one hand resting near his concealed revolver. Penelope entered with Ms. Thorne moments before the hearing was scheduled to begin. She wore a simple blue dress borrowed from Sarah Miller, her honey-blonde hair arranged in a modest style. Though her face was pale, her steps were steady as she took her seat at the petitioner's table. Judge Miller entered, and the proceedings began with formal introductions and explanation of the case before the court. A petition for legal separation on grounds of cruelty, with potential for divorce under territorial law. Victor's attorney, a Mr. Reynolds from Denver, began by questioning the court's jurisdiction, arguing that as the marriage had been performed in Pennsylvania, only Pennsylvania courts could dissolve it. Judge Miller listened patiently before responding. The territorial court claims jurisdiction based on Miss Sinclair's current residence, and the alleged acts of cruelty having continued across multiple states during the petitioner's flight from her husband. The court will hear testimony before ruling on jurisdiction. It was a small victory, but Luke saw relief flicker across Penelope's face. At least she would have the chance to tell her story. Ms. Thorne called Penelope to testify first. With quiet dignity, she recounted her marriage to Victor Harrington, the gradual escalation of controlling behavior, and finally the physical abuse that had begun approximately 1 year into their marriage. He was always careful, she explained, her voice steady despite the difficult subject matter. The bruises were where clothing would cover them. If we had social engagements, he would refrain from striking me until afterward. Can you describe a specific incident, Ms. Thorne prompted gently. Penelope nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Last December, I received a letter from an old school friend without showing it to Victor first. When he discovered it, he locked me in our bedroom for 2 days without food. When he finally came back, she hesitated, then continued with visible effort. He broke 2 of my ribs with his walking stick. Then called the doctor and told him I had fallen down the stairs. Luke's fingers curled into fists as he listened, rage building within him at the thought of anyone treating her with such cruelty. Across the courtroom, Victor maintained an expression of injured innocence, occasionally shaking his head in apparent disbelief at Penelope's testimony. When Ms. Thorne finished her questioning, Mr. Reynolds approached for cross-examination, his manner deceptively gentle. Mrs. Harrington, did any of these alleged incidents occur with witnesses present? No, Penelope admitted. Victor was careful to ensure privacy. And did you report these alleged abuses to authorities at any time? No, I was afraid. Afraid, Reynolds repeated skeptically. Yet you managed to plan an elaborate escape, stealing family heirlooms in the process. That hardly sounds like the action of a frightened woman. Objection, Ms. Thorne interjected. Counsel is editorializing. Sustained, Judge Miller ruled. Rephrase your question, Mr. Reynolds. Reynolds smiled thinly. Did you take jewelry and other valuables when you left your husband's home? I took only items that were mine by inheritance from my mother, Penelope clarified. They were legally mine before my marriage. Yet you sold these items to finance your journey, Reynolds made the word sound sordid. Yes, I had no other resources. Victor controlled all our finances. The questioning continued in this vein, with Reynolds attempting to paint Penelope as a calculating thief rather than an abused wife. Throughout, she maintained her composure, though Luke could see the toll the ordeal was taking in the tightness around her eyes and mouth. When Reynolds finally concluded, Ms. Thorne called Dr. Martin, who had examined Penelope the previous day. The doctor testified to finding evidence of previously broken ribs, healed fractures in her right wrist, and scarring consistent with repeated physical trauma. In my professional opinion, Dr. Martin stated firmly, these injuries are consistent with the pattern of abuse described by Miss Sinclair. Victor took the stand next, presenting himself as a devoted husband bewildered by his wife's unexpected departure and theft of family valuables. Penelope has always been high-strung, he explained to the court, his voice dripping with concern. Subject to fits of hysteria and wild imaginings, I indulged her because I loved her, but I fear she has convinced herself of these fantastic stories of abuse. And the injuries documented by Dr. Martin, Judge Miller inquired. Victor shook his head sadly. Penelope was always accident-prone, falling downstairs, tripping over carpets. I employed the finest doctors to care for her. Luke watched Penelope's face during this testimony, seeing the flash of anger beneath her composed exterior. This was not a new experience for her, being labeled hysterical, having her reality denied by the man who had systematically abused her. The hearing continued through the afternoon, with character witnesses for both parties. By the time Judge Miller called a recess to consider his ruling, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Luke approached Penelope as she consulted with Ms. Thorne. You're doing well, he said quietly. Miller seems to believe you. Penelope offered a tired smile. I hope so. Victor is very convincing when he wants to be. Not to anyone with eyes to see, Luke assured her. They didn't have long to wait for the judge's decision. When court reconvened an hour later, Judge Miller delivered his ruling with clear conviction. Having heard testimony from both parties and examined the evidence presented, this court finds sufficient cause to grant the petition for legal separation on grounds of cruelty. He fixed Victor with a stern gaze. Furthermore, the protective order preventing Mr. Harrington from approaching or communicating with Miss Sinclair will remain in effect indefinitely. Relief washed over Penelope's face as the judge continued, outlining the terms of separation and the schedule for further proceedings regarding potential divorce. Victor's reaction was immediate and explosive. He surged to his feet, ignoring his lawyer's restraining hand. This is preposterous. You have no jurisdiction over my marriage. I have jurisdiction over persons residing in this territory, Judge Miller replied evenly. Including your wife, this ruling stands, Mr. Harrington. She is my property, Victor shouted, his facade of concerned husband evaporating in his rage. I will not be denied what is legally mine. A murmur ran through the courtroom at this outburst. Even Victor's lawyer looked uncomfortable with his client's choice of words. Your Honor, Reynolds began, attempting damage control, my client is understandably emotional. Your client, Judge Miller interrupted coldly, has just demonstrated precisely the temperament Miss Sinclair described in her testimony. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Harrington from my courtroom. As the bailiff approached, Victor's expression contorted with fury. He reached inside his coat, and Luke was moving before conscious thought, vaulting over the railing that separated spectators from the court floor. Gun, someone shouted as Victor withdrew a small derringer from his coat. Luke tackled him just as the weapon discharged, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling. They crashed to the floor together, Luke wresting the derringer from Victor's grasp as courthouse guards rushed forward to subdue him. You're dead, O'Malley, Victor hissed as guards dragged him to his feet. You and that whore both. Luke rose slowly, handing the weapon to the bailiff. Across the chaotic courtroom, his eyes found Penelope's. She stood frozen beside Ms. Thorne, shock evident in her expression, but beneath it something else. A dawning realization that Victor had finally revealed his true nature publicly, destroying his own carefully crafted facade. Judge Miller restored order with several sharp raps of his gavel. Mr. Harrington will be held on charges of attempting to discharge a firearm in my courtroom, as well as threatening the life of court participants. This hearing is adjourned. As Victor was led away, still shouting threats, Luke made his way to Penelope's side. Are you all right? She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. I never thought he would go so far. Not in public. Men like that eventually show their true colors, Luke said grimly. It was just a matter of time. Judge Miller approached them, his expression troubled. Miss Sinclair, I apologize for that display. Rest assured Mr. Harrington will be held until formal charges are filed. He glanced at Luke. Quick thinking, Mr. O'Malley. Could have been a tragedy otherwise. Luke shrugged uncomfortably, just reacted. Well, your reaction may have saved lives. The judge turned back to Penelope. The separation is granted, but I strongly advise remaining under protection until we can secure the divorce. Harrington won't be held forever, and his outburst today suggests he's becoming unstable. She can stay at the Circle M as long as needed, Frank Miller offered, joining their group. No safer place in the territory. Outside the courthouse, as they prepared to return to the Miller ranch, Penelope drew Luke aside. You could have been killed, she said quietly, her green eyes searching his face. Why would you risk that for me? Luke considered the question, finding the answer simpler than he would have expected a month ago. Because you matter to me, he said simply, more than I thought anyone could again. Tears welled in Penelope's eyes. Luke O'Malley, you are nothing like the solitary, gruff cowboy you pretend to be. Don't tell anyone, he replied with a small smile. I have a reputation to maintain. Her laugh was watery but genuine, and when she stepped forward to embrace him, Luke found himself holding her tightly, as though she might disappear if he let go. The journey back to the Circle M was subdued, all of them processing the dramatic events of the hearing. Victor's public breakdown had achieved what months of legal maneuvering might not have, indisputable evidence of his volatile nature and the danger he posed to Penelope. Judge Miller had promised to expedite the divorce proceedings in light of the new developments. With Victor in custody and formal charges pending, Penelope had breathing space to consider her future more carefully. That evening, as they sat on the Miller's porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Luke found himself contemplating his own future with newfound clarity. 5 years of isolation had been his response to loss and grief, a way of ensuring he never again experienced the pain of attachment. Yet in the span of a few weeks, Penelope Sinclair had upended that careful strategy, awakening feelings he'd thought long buried. What are you thinking about? She asked, her voice breaking into his thoughts. You look very serious. Luke turned to face her, struck anew by her quiet beauty in the fading light. I'm thinking that I've been hiding from life for too long. Penelope's expression softened. It's a natural response to pain, I understand it better than most. But it's not living, Luke said, the realization crystallizing as he spoke. It's just existing. And now, she prompted gently. Luke reached for her hand, an action that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. Now I'm wondering if you might consider staying in Wyoming, not just until the divorce, but after. Penelope's fingers curled around his. Are you asking me to stay for a particular reason, Mr. O'Malley? I might be, he admitted, a smile tugging at his lips. Though I should warn you, my cabin's smaller than this place. One room, drafty in winter. The nearest neighbors are 3 miles away. It sounds perfect, she replied softly, though perhaps we could add a room or two eventually. The implication hung between them, full of promise and possibility. Luke found himself imagining it, a life shared rather than endured alone, the small cabin expanded to accommodate a family, children's laughter where there had been only silence. I'd like that, he said simply. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of legal proceedings and the changing seasons. Victor remained in custody, his influential Eastern connections proving less effective in Wyoming Territory than he had anticipated. Judge Miller moved forward with the divorce petition, gathering additional testimony that strengthened Penelope's case. Luke divided his time between the Circle M and his own property, gradually preparing the cabin for a more permanent occupant. He added a second room, improved the roof, and built proper furniture to replace the utilitarian pieces he'd cobbled together years ago. Frank and Sarah Miller became their staunchest supporters, providing not only physical safety but emotional encouragement as Luke and Penelope navigated their deepening relationship. It was Sarah who first suggested they make their union official once the divorce was finalized. No sense waiting, she declared practically. Life's too short for unnecessary delays, especially out here. 6 months after the fateful night, when Penelope had arrived at the saloon with mud-caked boots and desperate determination, Judge Miller granted her divorce on grounds of cruelty. Victor, still awaiting trial for his courthouse outburst, was served with the papers in his cell. 2 weeks later, Luke and Penelope were married in a simple ceremony at the Circle M, with Frank and Sarah as witnesses and Judge Miller officiating. Penelope wore a cream-colored dress Sarah had helped her make, with wildflowers in her honey-blonde hair. Luke, uncharacteristically nervous, appeared in a new suit purchased specifically for the occasion. As they exchanged vows beneath the spreading branches of the ranch's oldest cottonwood tree, Luke marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From isolated survivor to husband, from solitary existence to shared life, transformations he would never have believed possible a year ago. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Judge Miller declared with evident satisfaction. You may kiss your bride, Mr. O'Malley. Luke needed no further encouragement. Drawing Penelope into his arms, he kissed her with a tenderness that belied his former reputation as Laramie's most confirmed bachelor. Their new life together began that evening, when Luke brought his bride home to the expanded cabin that would be their first shared dwelling. As they crossed the threshold, Thunder and Daisy grazing contentedly in the nearby pasture, Luke felt a sense of rightness that had eluded him for years. "Welcome home, Mrs. O'Malley," he said, watching as Penelope took in the improvements he'd made. The new curtains at the windows, the second room with its marriage bed, the rocking chair beside the fireplace. "It's perfect," she declared, turning to wrap her arms around his neck. "Everything I've ever wanted." Later that night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Penelope's head resting on his chest, Luke thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. A broken stagecoach wheel, a desperate journey through wilderness, a midnight arrival at a saloon where by chance he had lingered later than usual. "What are you thinking?" Penelope murmured sleepily. Luke pressed a kiss to her forehead. "That sometimes the best things in life arrive unexpectedly, even at midnight, even with mud-caked boots." Penelope's soft laughter filled the cabin as she raised her face for his kiss. Outside, the Wyoming night wrapped around their small home, stars wheeling overhead, the future stretching before them like an unwritten page. For the first time in years, Luke O'Malley looked forward to tomorrow with joy rather than resignation. And all because a determined young woman had walked 15 miles through wilderness, arriving at a saloon at midnight with no horse, but with the courage that had changed both their lives forever.